Hi, folks. Previously on the Philosophy Salon, we discussed the central features of Scrooge's socioeconomic philosophy and its moral shortcomings. And we contrasted this with Scrooge's changed orientation and discussed how it is ethically superior to the latter. So I now want to discuss the personality factors underlying Scrooge's laissez-faire socioeconomic philosophy: introversion, neuroticism, and disagreeableness. So to begin, the first personality trait underlying Scrooge's laissez-faire philosophy that I would like to examine is introversion. So the question is, what is introversion? Introversion is the contrasting counterpart of the extroversion dimension of personality. Introversion may be characterized as a state of being predominantly interested in oneself. Introverts tend to be reserved and reflective. According to one view, introverts' energy comes from reflection and diminishes with social interaction. And that's Carl Jung's view, among others. So another fitting question to ask is, in what ways does Scrooge manifest introverted traits? And one of the most striking introverted characteristics that Scrooge exemplifies is his tendency to engage in solitary activities. For example, he prefers to be left alone while he works. He lives alone, he eats alone. And for these reasons, Dickens' characterization of Scrooge as solitary as an oyster is particularly fitting. Another question to ask is, what factors might explain Scrooge's introversion? So factors that might explain Scrooge's introversion might be because he is easily overwhelmed by too much stimulation from social gatherings and engagement. And this hypothesis provides one reason why he declines Fred's invitation to attend his Christmas dinner. It might simply be too engaging and stimulating for him to handle. Scrooge also exhibits another introverted trait: his tendency to observe situations before participating in them. For instance, Scrooge must first observe his nephew Fred's Christmas party scene as it is revealed to him by his imaginal vision, evoked through the agency of the ghost of Christmas present, before he actually commits to going to the party. And perhaps one way of explaining this is that observing the party before participating in it acts as a kind of exposure therapy. It allows Scrooge to desensitize himself to any social anxiety through imaginal contact with the social situation, the party, and to habituate to a more stable and socially adaptive emotions like calmness in the midst of a social situation. So considering all of these introverted traits, we can make better sense of Scrooge's tendency towards advocating and embodying the laissez-faire philosophy of wanting to be left alone. Scrooge wishes to be left alone because he's introverted in the manner discussed. As Scrooge undergoes his transformation in personality as the story develops, however, we see Scrooge evolve into a more extroverted being. And with his personality change, we see a corresponding change in his social economic philosophy. So how's all of that sitting, Ryan? Do you think this is a fairly accurate or plausible account of Scrooge's personality traits here? Do you think the factors that I outlined might explain his introversion? What's your take here?
I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head here. And another thing that comes to mind, though, which I think we'll get to later, is sort of the link between introversion and a certain kind of neuroticism as well. So I think that might also play a role in his tendency maybe to get, overstimulated engaging with others.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he has a tendency towards like perfectionism as
Mhm.
well. So I think, especially when he's around other people, he might be quite judgmental.
Mhm.
Uh, and that, being in an environment where you're constantly judging other people, comparing yourself to other people, it's quite exhausting. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think there's maybe a link there between his introversion and his neuroticism, but I don't want to get too much into that right now. We'll get into that later.
Sure. No, but I think it's a good observation you brought up. And I think it also points to the fact that, in personality theory, all the different personality traits, they're not mutually exclusive necessarily. They interconnect, they interpenetrate, one can affect the other. And so, I mean, the big five in some sense, if you visualize it as an interconnected pentagon of the traits, they all link into one another, perhaps to a degree. Um, and and the differences between different people are perhaps differences in degree and not kind. And there might be all sorts of individual differences as far as how the different traits link up with one another and affect one another as well. But it definitely seems plausible to suppose that introversion, insofar as it might be prompted by like social anxiety, social anxiety, of course, strikes me as being a very neurotic quality. So yeah, we can revisit that for sure as we go along here. And speaking of going along, the next section here that I want to start discussing here is the second personality trait um, that seems to become more manifest and predominant in the reform Scrooge. And this is the trait of extroversion. So, what is extroversion? Well, extroversion is the contrasting counterpart of the introversion dimension of personality. Extroversion uh, is opposite to uh, introversion on the uh, big five personality spectrum, and it's characterized essentially as um, so one of the most straight. So the question to ask is, in what ways, or the question to ask is, what is extroversion? And extroversion is the contrasting counterpart to the introversion dimension of personality. And extroversion is opposite to neuroticism on the personality spectrum, and it's a trait of a person being so. Okay, so extroversion is another dimension of personality characterized as a trait of being a person who enjoys being with other people. Extroverts tend to be enthusiastic, talkative, assertive, and gregarious. Extroverts, in contrast to introverts, extroverts' energy comes from being around other people. As such, they thrive in social situations. And this is another uh, idea that was perhaps most well-knownly put forward by Jung. And extroverts tend to find pleasure in participating in large social gatherings like parties, community activities, public demonstrations, business or political groups. So a question to ask is, in what ways does the reformed Scrooge manifest extroversion? So one of the most striking extroverted characteristics that Scrooge demonstrates after he has undergone his transformation is his newfound gregariousness. He no longer wishes to be left alone. He wishes to participate in Fred's Christmas party, dinner, and he wishes to be more socially involved with Bob Cratchit and his family. For example, becoming a friend to Bob Cratchit, becoming a second father to Tiny Tim. And so the next relevant question I think to ask is, what factors contribute to an increase in Scrooge's extroversion? And my own thinking is that Scrooge's extroversion increases as a result of remembering his former, more extroverted self. And this is through revisiting his scenes of his youthful self being sociable, say at Fezziwig's party. Perhaps it's also through the behavioral modeling and the internalization of Fred and his other sociable Freds during the vicarious experiences he has when he's given a vision of Fred's Christmas party by the ghost of Christmas present, and in particular in experiencing the joy of being at that party, you know, vicariously through Fred and through the other friends of Fred. And you had your own take on this, Ryan. What did you want to comment on here?
Well, first, I thought it was interesting that he was living this vision vicariously. You know, he was at the Christmas party vicariously, which is in still some way an introverted way of experiencing things, like you mentioned earlier. So I thought that was interesting. But I think that vision has sort of allowed him to perceive the other in a different way. You know, he sees them more in terms of their humanity as an individual, you know, rather than seeing them in sort of uh, or sort of as a cog in a wheel.
Yeah.
Or sorry, a cog in a machine.
Yeah.
uh, you know, or some sort of numbers in a ledger book. So he tends to be less cold towards them and more willing to engage with them for the sake of it. I think he doesn't see them as like an enemy or as someone that he can get something from.
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point you bring up there. And I think it offers some nice illumination. It also brought to mind for me Fred's remarks in the first stave of the novella, in which he's talking. It's sort of his big exposition of his own philosophy of Christmas and what like Christmas time means to him. And he talks about like Christmas time for him has always been a time where like, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing and sort of trying to get to the gist of what he said here, but he says something along the lines of Christmas time for me has always been a time where, you know, I've kind of reestablished my connectivity with all human beings, you know, and viewed them as, you know, one and the same as me, you know, as fellow travelers rather than like a separate race of human beings. And, you know, I think that's, you know, precisely what you were sort of intimating there in terms of Scrooge, you know, recognizing and perceiving the other, say in Bob Cratchit or in the charity solicitors, whoever else he encounters, you know, after his Reformation, and seeing them as fellow human beings rather than, you know, parasites or insects or cogs in a machine or numbers in a ledger book.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's sort of trying to advocate a return for sort of the principles espoused by like Jesus, sort of that like love and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, he's trying to remind people that, you know, this is a time to reconnect yourself with that sort of outlook on life or outlook on humanity. Um, because I think even today, I mean, we go through life, we get really busy, and even with my own family sometimes, you know, it's like, man, I'm not seeing them enough. You know, I'm just sort
Mm-hmm.
of meeting my obligations and sort of
Mm-hmm.
treating them as, you know, just my mom. Not but
Mm-hmm.
not treating them as like an individual, you know, treating them as like a role or
Right.
something like that. You know,
Right.
because you get so caught up with your life, you know, with work and everything else. And I think the holidays when you can slow down and spend that time with them, you can kind of, you know, you hear stories too. They share stories that humanize them,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that turn them into human beings, not just sort of, oh, hey, that's my mom. You know, that's an actual person with life experiences. So, yeah, I think it's a time for that we can reconnect with people and see them for, you know, the individuals that they are.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess maybe that sense of connectivity between all human beings is something that can prompt a tendency to be more or extroverted, because when you feel connected to other people, you want to open yourself up to those people, and you want to be more talkative and you know um, uh, fully experience that connectivity through social interaction and through being sociable. And so yeah, I think these are all valid thoughts and hypotheses to explain what factors might contribute to his extroversion. And another personality trait underlying Scrooge's laissez-faire philosophy is his disagreeableness. So the question is, what is disagreeableness? Disagreeableness is at the opposite end of the agreeableness dimension of personality. And people who are disagreeable can exhibit selfish behavior, which can manifest as stinginess and lack of empathy. So a relevant question to ask is in what ways does the reformed Scrooge manifest, the unreformed Scrooge manifest disagreeableness? So the disagreeable qualities that I've just mentioned are particularly applicable to Scrooge, who Mrs. Cratchit characterizes as odious, stingy, hard, and unfeeling. And this stinginess and this lack of empathy are demonstrated throughout the early stages of the story. In the beginning, for instance, he adamantly refuses to give any money to the charity solicitors and exudes a callous irreverence for the poor and the destitute in declaring that if they are unwilling to work, then they ought to die to decrease the surplus population. And this gets to his Malthusianism, which we discussed in our previous conversation. So his Malthusianism seems to be inextricably linked to this disagreeableness in some sense, it would seem. Now, Scrooge also manifests this stinginess when considering, for example, how he keeps his office building operating with a minimum of heat, allowing only for a paltry amount of coal in Cratchit's furnace to save on heating costs, regardless of the discomfort and health risks that this might pose to Cratchit. He does not empathize with Cratchit's financial struggle to support his family also. And this is exemplified by the fact that he pays Cratchit a meager salary. I think he pays him something like 15 shillings a week, which I think in Victorian times was just a very small, meager income. So relevant to understanding the full depth of Scrooge's disagreeableness and his disagreeable personality is a consideration of how this factor maps onto a Christian characterization of this trait, namely the trait of avariciousness. What is avariciousness? Avariciousness is an extreme desire for wealth. It's a vice of character that was regarded as among one of the 7 deadly sins in the biblical context and within a Christian moral framework. Scrooge's avariciousness is seen in his miserliness, which impels him to excessive thrift and thus leads him to living a bare existence. Scrooge's excessive thrift is morally harmful, however, as his thrift does not stop with himself, but also extends to others, and thus jeopardizes the security of those, for example, the poor, destitute, Cratchit and his family, who look for him for subsistence. For instance, Scrooge pays Cratchit a mere 15 shillings per week, as I noted, and as a result, he's so underpaid that he cannot adequately support his family, which are dependent upon him, most especially Tiny Tim, who needs costly medical interventions to ensure that he'll survive. Scrooge also, for example, refuses to contribute to a charity fund to buy food for the hungry. Scrooge's miserliness in each case indicates that Scrooge is void of Christian love, which for Dickens was an essential concept in the spirit of Christmas. And so I guess this raises the developmental question: how does Scrooge's avariciousness emerge? The development of Scrooge's avariciousness, I think, can be traced back to his young adulthood, at least. And we see in the vision presented by the ghost of Christmas past that Scrooge's one-time sweetheart breaks off their relationship due to his, and this is in her words, changed nature. He's exchanged his desire for love for his extreme desire for wealth in this instance. It's unclear to me what precise factors led to an increase in Scrooge's avariciousness. Perhaps it was partly philosophical. I think that he might have begun to internalize the seductive precepts of the laissez-faire ethic based on the principles of scarcity, which were floating around in the moral milieu of the Victorian epoch. But as Scrooge undergoes his transformation through his experiences guided by the three ghosts of Christmas, Scrooge becomes less disagreeable and more agreeable. And in other words, his agreeableness comes to become the more predominant trait. So given that linking of disagreeableness to Scrooge's socioeconomic philosophy, do you think, Ryan, do you think that is a good way of accounting for, Scrooge's, the state of Scrooge's socioeconomic philosophy as we kind of encounter it in the earlier stages of the story? And do you think it can be traced to disagreeableness? And do you think that it's his change in his socioeconomic philosophy can be traced to a decrease in his agreeableness?
Well, I noticed, when I was reading and going through the notes as well, you mentioned at one point, I can't remember where it was, Fred questioning, how is it that Scrooge can be so seemingly miserable yet so wealthy?
Yeah.
How could he be so, I believe the word he uses is morose.
Yes.
And because I think I tend towards reading Nietzsche and those sorts of existentialist philosophers, my immediate response was, well, that morose nature or that disagreeable nature, that tendency to be dissatisfied and unhappy with things, that is actually the basis for his tendency towards laissez-faire capitalism. So if you're someone who's constantly dissatisfied with the state of affairs, uncomfortable, you're probably going to be motivated, someone who's motivated to seek a remedy for that, right? Like, I don't want to be, uncomfortable anymore,
Mm-hmm.
So you go and you seek, you pursue wealth accumulation,
Mm-hmm.
which inevitably is an endless process. And at the same time, it's sort of it's really not going to help, like we are human beings. There's a sort of inevitable suffering built in to life,
right?
And you're never going to be able to eliminate sort of that discomfort or suffering. So these disagreeable people, they get locked into that inevitable pursuit of, or sorry, that endless pursuit of wealth.
Right. Right.
As you see in Scrooge. So
right.
I think, Fred's questioning of, how could he be so morose? I was like, well, that's why he is is the way he is. It wasn't as if, he became a capitalist and was, an industrious person and then became miserable. He was a miserable person, and that's what motivated him to become who he is today.
Right. And so do you think his miserableness can be linked to his avariciousness and his excessive selfishness? It's just a desire to covet money, and that could be explained as sort of a remedy to his misery.
Yeah,
In some
I think
sense.
he tries to use that as a remedy. And I think too, when you look at, studies that talk about um, personality traits and income, whether or not you're going to get a raise or a promotion, people who tend to be more disagreeable tend to make more money, right?
Yeah.
Because they're more likely to go to their boss and say, "Hey, look, like I deserve X, Y, and Z." They're more likely to be dissatisfied with the current state of affairs and
Right.
pursue more. So
Right.
I think, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good explanation, and I think too that it points out the again the link between the different personality traits, between like neuroticism and disagreeableness. Like to the
Mhm.
extent that Scrooge is morose and exhibits a depressed mood, you could say even, um, you know, to that degree, that motivates him to perhaps as a defense mechanism or something like that to fill that void of happiness with excessive um, money or solely money, but to the neglect of things like love. So while he might be abundant in money, he's void of love, as I've mentioned. Um, and so yeah, no, I think that's a good interaction between neuroticism and um, disagreeableness. So
I I also don't want to seem like I'm demonizing disagreeableness. I think that, Scrooge can be seen as someone who exhibits disagreeableness to the extreme. And same goes for, people who are hyper agreeable. There's sort of negatives that go with that too. Those people pleasers that, are super nice, tell you what you want to hear, but at the end of the day, you can't trust a word they say.
right.
Those are the kind of people that will also backstab you, just like sort of that disagreeable person who's, in the pursuit of power or wealth, or, they'll screw over their business partner if they have to. But yeah, I don't want to sound like I'm demonizing disagreeableness. It's just
Yeah.
on the
No.
extent to which, yeah,
Yeah.
Scrooge shows it. Yeah.
No, for sure. I think that's another valid point, and I also think too it points to the again to like the golden mean, and how any personality trait in excess or in deficiency, you know, um, leads to becoming a vicious person, and that's the case with disagreeableness. It's the case with agreeableness, and I think um, the virtuous person, um, the well-adjusted person is the person who kind of can find that mean between those extremes, and I think like disagreeableness in moderation can be adaptive. I think agreeableness within moderation can be adaptive. And if you look at the studies on personality, the studies show that the personality traits, the big five traits we've been talking about, have like this curvilinear relationship. So like to a certain point, they're adaptive and that they promote human well-being. But beyond that point, that leads to like a gradual, you know, um, decrease in well-being. So, you know, nothing in excess, nothing in deficiency, I suppose, eh?
I think that's also true too. Like, say you're someone with, certain uh, behavioral proclivities, that, certain vices, if you will. Uh, there's a certain extent to which having a certain amount of money is good. But if you're someone that has those vices and has too much money,
Mm-hmm.
it's not good for you. So
Mm-hmm.
like having these things in excess or whatever it is, I think, if you don't have, the rest of your life in order, it can really be maladaptive.
Mm-hmm.
It can really lead to more destructive behavior.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point. For me, it kind of gets to this, like the metaphor of like, It's not knives themselves that kill people. Like it's, wayward people and vicious people that kill people, right? And, I think any philosophy has potential to do good or do bad, depending on upon the person who, um, espouses that philosophy and who embodies that philosophy. And I think laissez-faire capitalism can maybe be a case in point. Like I'm not here demonizing laissez-faire capitalism per se or in laissez-faire capitalists, just to say that, if certain personality characteristics, say like of Scrooge's, excessive disagreeableness, if those are in play, then laissez-faire capitalism can be twisted, I guess, to sort of malicious ends, I suppose. Whereas,
I think that you're totally right. Like, especially if you look at the Malthusian aspect of it, like, depending on what your response is, like, to that principle of, a population will eventually outgrow its ability to produce food or to create a sufficient food supply.
Yeah.
So if you're confronted with that principle or that idea, I think depending on what your response to that is, will determine, a whole heck of a lot. And I think we saw that, in the 20th century, the the communists basically said, you know, Malthusianism, sure, but that's only because of capitalism,
right.
right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna have a revolution, overturn capitalism, and then the Malthusian principle is no longer a problem, essentially.
Right.
That's sort of more or less the idea, roughly. It's a much an oversimplification, but then you have like Nazis who go, okay, well, we can't change the principle, but what we have to do is change our physical environmental circumstances so that we can have a certain population that's sustainable with enough land, with Slav slaves that
Yep.
will produce the food, right? So you can see the problems that, or the ideas in laissez-faire capitalism and how they were responded to throughout the 20th century. And I think, like, I could just see Dickens being like, hey guys, like, this is a huge problem. Like, if we don't change and reform, like, how we're responding to one another and how society's dealing with this, like, we're going to have a whole heck of a mess.
Yeah.
Like, that's sort of what I see him conveying here, whether or not he knows the extent of the problem or what the consequences really will be. But yeah, like this is sort of like what's really come to the forefront, like looking at the principles within laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah. No, I think these are all valid observations. And I think that, you're right in suggesting that Dickens is pointing out the moral shortcomings, perhaps, of um, laissez-faire capitalism when it's malpracticed. I think he's trying to reconcile, say, capitalism with ethics to some degree, and to suggest perhaps that perhaps the more malicious, malpracticed aspects of laissez-faire capitalism can be gentled and can be rendered more benevolent through a reformation of the individual, like as in Scrooge, becoming, like the embodiment of, Christ on earth, and loving thy neighbor and embodying that spirit of benevolence, which Dickens linked to the Christmas spirit as well.
I think America in the early 20th century really embodied what Dickens was trying to express was, America, as a political entity is, or as a state, it's not a religious state, but the community itself is profoundly and probably one of the most religious Christian states at the time, right? So, but they were capitalists. So it's like this this capitalism, but infused with Christian ethics and morality,
Mm-hmm.
which is what I think helped make it not nearly as horrific as some of the things you saw like in Europe and other
Mm-hmm.
parts of the world, was that fusion of capitalism, but that deep rooted Christian moral, or the morality or ethics,
Mm-hmm.
that were just ingrained within the people. They're very, very fun. They were and still are, compared to Europe, very fundamentalist in terms of their Christianity. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, that being said, you can see how what seems to be the fading of Christian morality and ethics, or the dominance of it within the West. And I think that's perhaps why you're seeing, capitalism sort of run off and do some of the things that it's doing that's making people unhappy today.
Yeah.
So it's difficult, especially if you're an atheist, right? Because
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
if you're someone who doesn't believe in religion or God or whatever, you can still see the value of why these two things work together. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
just some food for thought.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I think it's good food for thought, which is worthy of chewing and digesting. All I'll have to say about this, without going too far down a rabbit hole, is that I think what you're saying points out more broadly to the um, relationship between um, our ethical philosophy and our um, socioeconomic philosophy, or political philosophy. And I think that um, insofar as our uh, philosophy, if we want to consider our philosophy holistically, in viewing all the aspects of our philosophy as part of like one unified whole, if one part of that whole is in some sense lacking or deficient, say like our ethical um, mode of thought is lacking or deficient, then that's going to have an adverse effect on other aspects of our philosophy, like our economic philosophy and our political philosophy. So I think there's, maybe a reciprocal interaction between those different aspects, um, and so I think
Just
that.
as
Oh yeah, go
just
ahead.
just a side note, we can edit this part out or whatever,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I think it would be good too to discuss, what we believe to be, first philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So this gets to the root of, you know, what is first philosophy? Is it epistemology, as Kant says, or before Kant, as it had traditionally been? Is it metaphysics, or as Levinas talks about, like, is it moral or ethical philosophy? Um, I personally tend towards the moral ethical philosophy, um, and I think you can see too, like in throughout history, when the Christians, they weren't allowed to be bankers and lend money and charge interest. So that
Mm-hmm.
that further lends to that idea that our moral or ethical philosophy informs our economic.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think I can sympathize with that view in several respects. I think um, a lot of the philosophy that I gravitate towards is pragmatism, and pragmatism, examines like the utility and the usefulness of our beliefs and of our philosophical systems, and in some versions, um, the degree to which our philosophical systems, promote things like our well-being and so on. And so, our metaphysical systems and our epistemological systems and our economic systems, um, you know, the appropriate approach to thinking about those systems and contemplating them and developing them and implementing them is one of how do these philosophical systems lend themselves to improving our well-being, rather than say how are these philosophical systems, how are these um, systems in some sense uh, true of reality, or um, accurately map reality or represent reality. Those questions of truth are perhaps can't be considered independently of questions of, like value and the usefulness of those ideas and systems and so on. So yeah, it's definitely something I'd like to, we could talk about in a whole other conversation. So let's footnote that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah,
Let's move on to the next part here.
sure. So I'd like to move on now to considering what agreeableness is. Agreeableness is a personality trait characterized by the tendency to be kind, sympathetic, cooperative, and considerate. Those who are highly agreeable are empathetic and altruistic. And um, and so the question is, how does Scrooge manifest agreeableness? How does the reformed Scrooge manifest agreeableness? Well, the qualities of agreeableness that I just mentioned are particularly predominant in Scrooge after he's reformed his character. And when he's undergone his transformation, he's no longer selfish, but altruistic. And instead of being stingy with his money, he's overwhelmingly generous with it, which is clearly illustrated when he makes recompense with the charity solicitors and offers them a large sum of money with many back payments. And again, I think this is linking back to the abundance mindset, which we previously talked about. And I think so. Yeah, that's worth noting there. And Scrooge's agreeableness is also seen in his desire to give generously by purchasing an enormous Christmas turkey for the Cratchit family, and by raising Cratchit's salary, and by supporting his struggling family financially. And Ryan, I think you had a thought you wanted to contribute here regarding Scrooge's reformation.
I think I pretty much covered it already. You know, uh, just sort of goes to Dickens continuing to sort of urge this reformation of culture,
Yep.
away from sort of demonizing or dehumanizing the other, sort of that idea or sort of that milieu that was around that ushered in the 20th century, proletariat versus bourgeois, Aryan versus Jew, just sort of that whole um, racial, spiritual, cultural division that was going on at the time, after the fall of all the monarchies. Um, yeah, so it just really seems like he's continuing to push for that doctrine of love, sort of built into Christianity. It seems like we've moved sort of to the opposite or the reverse of love thy neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at someone like Scrooge at the beginning of the novella. So, yeah, I think it just continues to go at that point where he's sort of urging us to come back to that doctrine of Christian love.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's a very valid point, and I think it's worth restating and reemphasizing too, because particularly with this trait, the increase in agreeableness does, in some sense, uh, represent an increase in love. Insofar as love is an agreeable trait or an aspect of agreeableness. Yeah. So that's
I think too, like the um being agreeable, it at least when it comes to sorry, let me rephrase.
sure.
So agreeableness on the far end isn't really concerned with, what other people actually wanted. It is in some sense selfish. But I think sort of that a moderate amount of agreeableness really involves in being genuinely concerned about what others want, listening to them, understanding, you know, what they value in
Hmm.
life. So yeah, I think again, going back to that Christian doctrine of love, you know, and being empathetic and altruistic, I think that's what it means to be empathetic and
Hmm.
altruistic, is genuinely caring about the other person and what it
Hmm.
is they want, separate from whatever it is you're going to gain from it.
Hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. Um, I think that's a very valid point you bring up there. So I suppose now, um, shifting from agreeableness itself to the question of uh, what factors instigate uh, Scrooge's transformation into a more agreeable person, um, I like to consider the following. So, Scrooge's imaginal experiences that are brought forth by the agency of the ghosts of Christmas, especially the ghost of Christmas past and present, evoke within him feelings of love, which lends itself to the internalization and cultivation of the spirit of Christmas. For instance, his imaginal revisiting of his past experience, guided by the ghost of Christmas, um, uh, Christmas past rather, evokes powerful ethical feelings within Scrooge. So, for example, when Scrooge, um, uh, revisits these past scenes, they seem to um, evoke feelings of remorse. And so, for example, when Scrooge oversees his former self alone and abandoned at the melancholy schoolhouse, um, he remembers the young caroler whom he ignored outside of his office, and this remembrance evokes feelings of remorse and of compassion, feelings which are part and parcel of love. Another example is when Scrooge beholds the imaginal vision of Fezziwig's party and re-experiences it. He comes to the realization that each individual has the power to make others happy through good deeds. And this is a power that cannot be achieved by mere money alone. And this experience evokes feelings of remorse for Cratchit, and his compassion and his love continues to expand. Another example is when Scrooge beholds a vision of Bob Cratchit's son, Tiny Tim, and the rest of the Cratchit family as they gather around the hearth with chestnuts roasting on an open fire. And this is like the postcard family Christmas scene. And Scrooge is struck by an emotion that seems to be uncharacteristic of him. And that is he feels compassion for the family and the concerns for the boy's chances for survival. And upon exposure to these scenes of the Cratchit family, Scrooge's perception is also transformed. He no longer perceives Cratchit as a mere clerk, a functionary in his office, but as a person inherently worthy of respect and concern. And for me, this kind of reminded me of Kant and um, how, insofar as Cratchit is now perceived as having simply instrumental value, but as having intrinsic value. And in Kantian terms, Kant would suggest that he's now perceived as an end and not as a means. And Scrooge, moreover, overhears Tiny Tim talking to his family about his affliction without any self-pity and with a matter-of-fact willingness to accept that his affliction may serve a higher purpose. And perhaps Tiny Tim's selfless spirit grabs Scrooge's attention, and while he perceives Tiny Tim's motivations as selfless, he might simultaneously come to the realization that his own motivations have been inherently selfish. And perhaps in this scene, too, Scrooge's understanding of what is meaningful shifts. He may come to see that a person can possess wealth other than a monetary kind. And we talked about this in our previous conversation. And indeed, Tiny Tim and the Cratchit family are wealthy in spirit and in love. And we might say they're wealthy in the Christmas spirit. And this is a notion that Scrooge had previously thought of as inconceivable. And I think that these feelings might sensitize Scrooge to the plight of others and to his own plight. And so, Ryan, you had a thought you wanted to bring up here?
Yeah, I just wanted to rewind just for a second here. You mentioned that Scrooge starts to perceive Tiny Tim's motivations as selfless, and his is inherently selfish. I'm really interested to know where you stand on that. Like, I think in some sense, Tiny Tim's motivations can be perceived as selfish.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think everyone needs sort of meaning and purpose in their life. But I think the main distinction between Tiny Tim and Scrooge is that Tiny Tim doesn't make the meaning he generates for himself only aimed at himself.
Right.
Like, yes, we all need meaning and purpose in our life, and we can't do something completely altruistic per se.
Mm-hmm.
But, as long as we're aiming, meaning or involving others in the generation of our meaning, I think that's really what's important and what the distinction here is between Tiny Tim and someone like Scrooge.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I mean, um, selfishness per se might not be a bad thing. Selfishness could be even maybe a good thing. And in particular, insofar as it's directed to not simply yourself, but to others. And it's a better thing. It's a better and more good thing because when you're not just focused, exclusively on yourself and you know promoting your own, your own self and your own well-being, but you're also trying to promote others and their well-being. Your life is in some sense more meaningful. So your life perhaps increases in meaning insofar as you are more other focused rather than merely self-focused, and that meaning is in some sense, you know, one of the central goals of our existence. Along with promoting our own well-being, it's also promoting our own and increasing our own meaning in life as well. And maybe those two go hand in hand.
I think it's also just a different way of perceiving selfishness. Like true selfishness, isn't, you know, uh, doing something for yourself, but doing something just for yourself. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? Like really not taking anybody else into consideration.
Right.
In that sense, like we all do things. We're all motivated as human beings to do things to, satisfy some desire. It's very, I think, rare or if impossible to do something completely selflessly. So yeah, I think it just is maybe a different conception of selfishness to think about. But yeah, um, I think we should move on here because we're reaching
Yes.
the end of our time.
Yeah, no, for sure. So just to continue the thread that we were on, Scrooge's uh, Scrooge inquires about the fate of Tiny Tim with the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost notes that Tiny Tim's dire fate may be avoided, provided there's a timely intervention. And the ghost also makes the ironic remark, throwing back at Scrooge's own words, and that he'd previously uttered about the sick and the destitute. And the ghost says, ironically, if he'd be like to die, he'd be better do it to decrease the surplus population. So Scrooge, now somewhat transformed, hears these words differently now that he has seen the people to whom they apply, perhaps now realizing them to be heartless and incongruent with his newfound compassion. And um, and so he's beginning to see the moral bankruptcy of Malthusianism, and he's beginning to see the fallaciousness of the scarcity mindset, I think. So A final personality characteristic I'd like to examine in relation to Scrooge's socioeconomic philosophy is his neuroticism. What is neuroticism? Neuroticism is the personality characteristic defined by negative emotions, feelings, and moods. This includes the negative feelings such as feeling anxious, worried, afraid, angry, frustrated, envious, jealous, guilty, depressed, and lonely. Question to ask is, in what ways does the reformed Scrooge, in what ways does the unreformed Scrooge manifest neuroticism? Well, in the case of Scrooge, his scarcity mentality, his obsession with a lack of time and money, might occur due to the presence of an irrational fear that there are not enough goods and resources to go around for everybody. Scrooge also demonstrates his neuroticism with respect to his mood and behavior. For instance, he appears to be in an irritable mood when the charity solicitors goad him into donating money. He also seems to be in a depressed mood, as is seen when Fred calls Scrooge out, asking why he is in such a morose mood, despite having an abundance of money. Scrooge's tendency to be irritable with the charity solicitors with minimal provocation and to be morose and to be in a morose mood with Fred, despite having an abundance of monetary wealth, might point to certain neurotic qualities that might bias him towards viewing a neutral situation or a neutral or a positive situation negatively. So he might have a negative emotional bias there. So the transformed Scrooge, however, demonstrates a noticeable decrement in his neuroticism and a significant increase in emotional stability and positive emotionality. So the question to ask is, what is emotional stability? Well, emotional stability is a trait opposite on the continuum of the neuroticism dimension of personality. And those who are higher in emotional stability are less reactive to stress, and they're more calm, they're even-tempered, and they tend to be less tense or rattled. And this is clearly demonstrated by the transformed Scrooge, who freely gives away large sums of money to the boy in the street for the turkey and to the charity solicitors without showing any sign of emotional perturbation. And then this other quality that increases in Scrooge as he becomes a person who has less neuroticism is this quality of positive emotionality. So positive emotionality, as I sort of briefly discussed in talking about extroversion, is a repertoire of positive emotions that often go hand in hand with extroversion, including emotions such as cheerfulness, enthusiasm, and excitability. And transformed Scrooge demonstrates almost a euphoria upon awakening in his bed after the visitation of the last ghost. He experiences joyfulness upon participating in Fred's dinner party and when declaring to Cratchit that he's going to raise his salary. Perhaps Scrooge's newfound stability and positivity can be attributed to a shift from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. He no longer perceives his world as lacking goods and resources for everyone, but as one in which goods and resources that can be plentifully supplied to everybody. So, do you think this is, Ryan, do you think this is an accurate accounting of Scrooge's personality, prior to undergoing these transformations? Like, would you characterize Scrooge as exhibiting, a high level of neuroticism, and maybe what factors do you think could contribute to that to begin with, and then perhaps we can consider the opposite side of the coin, like, do you think Scrooge demonstrates a decrease in neuroticism and an increase in positive emotionality and in emotional stability? So, What's your take here?
Yeah, I mean, I think early on he definitely shows more signs of neuroticism in his personality or temperament. That I think that can be seen, or sort of the origins can be seen, the Ghosts of Christmas Past. I think a lot of us are neurotic based on, maybe our early attachment styles, the relationships we have as a kid.
Right.
Just look at the one with his father, and yeah, I don't really
Yeah.
need to say more. Uh, yeah, so I think very early on he definitely does show signs of neuroticism, and I think the origins of that are fairly clear. And later on, I think he does open up. He becomes less neurotic, becomes sort of more calm, like you said, more even tempered, less tense or rattled. Um, as for what contributes to this, I might have to give that another, or just like another brief thought. I was sort of working through it there when you asked me the question. So if
Yeah.
you want to maybe sort of give your thoughts, and then we can maybe reconvene on that last
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, increases in emotional stability. Yeah. I mean, I suppose, if what we could maybe just kind of make sense of it behaviorally, um, perhaps in, in the final stave, uh, or in the final visitation with the ghost of uh, Christmas yet to come, Scrooge's, um, you know, it's almost like descending into the innermost ring of Dante's Inferno in some sense. He's going through hell. He's seeing what his future looks like. It's a future where nobody has any kind thoughts in regards about him, and no one really remembers him positively after his death. And he confronts his own death. The figure with the curtain draped over it is Scrooge's body, and he's horrified to lift that curtain over the body, and so maybe it's the confrontation with his own death, in some sense, that lends itself to an increase in emotional stability insofar as, when you confront that fact of your life and you become reconciled to it, you're no longer afraid of as much of death and of mortality and of the things that you associate with that, like all your fears and anxieties and so on and so forth, that are in some sense depend upon the fear of death. When the fear of death becomes extinguished, all the other associated fears and anxieties also in some sense might become extinguished. So it's kind of maybe his like imaginal experiences with the ghost of Christmas yet to come, might be kind of like this exposure therapy, which, desensitizes him to a lot of those excess fears and anxieties that he might have. So that's just one take and explanation of it.
Yeah, I think you sort of created or provided the other half of my picture for me. So
Right.
I really like what you just said there. The ghost of Christmas yet to come. Um, I think I think that experience that he had sort of shifted what it was that he valued in life. Confronting death, I think it changes that morose predisposition and that morose temperament. Because once you confront death, sort of all those, like you said, those anxieties, those discomforts, those things that he was trying to run away from no longer motivate him to run away.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So then what he values, which was once money and the accumulation of wealth, is no longer as valuable to him. And I think in some sense, it does result in um, him changing his views about whether or not, on scarcity. But I
Mm-hmm.
think really at the core of it, what it represents is a change in his idea of what someone needs, like what he needs in life to be happy,
Yeah.
right? Before, his idea of scarcity was there's not enough to go around.
Right.
Well, okay, but that's a certain point of view, but what is your idea of what each person needs, right? If your idea is hyperinflated, that every one person needs XYZ, like a car, an iPhone, a computer, a this and a
Right.
that, well, then yeah, maybe. But if you have something that's more realistic, a view on life that doesn't involve all of this stuff, and you realize, like, look, I don't need all this to be happy, well, then you can really start to realize, like, hey, there is enough to go around.
Right.
I don't need all of this money. I don't need all this wealth that I've accumulated. I can happily spread it around.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, for sure. So emotional stability in some sense, increases, insofar as, you have a proper conception of what your actual needs are, and knowing what your needs are, and perhaps knowing that your needs will be taken care of because there's perhaps an abundance of stuff in the universe rather than an artificial scarcity. And yeah, just thinking too about positive emotionality. Do we have any ideas about how his positive emotionality might increase?
Like what sort of was the cause of it, or how it was represented within the novella?
Well, yeah, like what factors might contribute to its increase,
Oh, I think that, like I said, that and like you said, that confrontation with death. I think that confrontation with death and being comfortable with the inevitability of it, I think that shifts his disagreeableness and his neuroticism, his fear, right? And so he is okay with, you know, uh, certain hardships in life before that he, or where before he was trying to escape them, if you know what I mean. Like
Right.
he, when you get comfortable with the idea of death, or if you face it in your death experience, or for example you're diagnosed with cancer, you really see that shift in personality. Like all of a sudden these people start living like their best lives because they realize, like, hey, what I need in life is not X, Y, and Z. It's not all of
Right.
this money, it's not this job, it's not this status.
Right.
It's just getting the most out of the moment,
Right.
right? And I think that is sort of what Scrooge has been confronted with, is that sort of reality of, like, similar to the person of, like, hey, you've been diagnosed with cancer,
Right.
right? Like, how are you going to choose to live out the rest of your life?
Right.
And you what you what you think you need out of life all of a sudden becomes very different, right? If you're not going to live, or if you're not going to, you realize the life that you are going to live is going to be a crippled one in one sense or another.
Right. Yeah. 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 For sure. No. Yeah. The inevitable consequences to uh, shift your values and to shift your outlook on life, and from a more negative outlook to a more positive outlook. And yeah, I think that's a valid observation. I also think that my own initial thought was that Scrooge also, um, again, this vicarious experience of being around people who are filled with positive emotions, like Fred himself, who's very jovial, and who has that incomparable laugh. I think Scrooge really benefits from being able to witness that party scene, kind of as an invisible spectator, and to really take in and absorb those positive emotions like a sponge. And I think that in so doing, he kind of experiences this joyfulness in participating, indirectly in this party. And I think we could, explain this in terms of like um, behavioral modeling and an internalization. Like in some sense, I think Scrooge is internalizing Fred's perspective, and he's internalizing the perspective of Fred's friends, which is a very positive emotional perspective. And that makes a lot of sense. And we know a lot about how much, human beings learn through imitation, and our brains are wired up to imitate. We have mirror neurons, and, so we're always seeking to imitate human beings on many different levels.
I think too, like his intro or his listening to Tiny Tim talk about his condition, and the matter of factness about which he talks about it.
Yeah.
He faces it square on without any anxiety or neuroticism. I think that too is sort of like a key point. Like, not only is he doing that, like he's a boy, he's not even a man, right? And here Scrooge is worrying about all of this X, Y, and Z, like all up in his head, like constantly concerned about paying people vacation pay or holiday pay on Christmas. When he's like the richest man in town. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Tiny Tim, faces his problems square in the face. Like, now who's the man here?
Yes, of course.
It seems like Scrooge is still stuck way back in his development. If you kind of want to take a Freudian, it's just
sort of a regression, perhaps a fixation on a certain level of development. And Tiny Tim sort of models and exemplifies this this courage, perhaps to face his fate, in such a matter-of-fact way, without any kind of emotional paralysis or moroseness, and avoiding this rumination and avoiding all of these things that we see manifest in Scrooge. And I hadn't considered that, but I also think that's a highly relevant point that you bring up there. So having considered all of these personality traits, these big five traits, and how Scrooge's change in social and economic philosophy can be linked to these transformations in personality, I'd like to maybe briefly sum up our conversation and with sort of the overarching question, which is based on our discussion thus far on Scrooge's changes in socioeconomic philosophy and his personality, his increases in extroversion, agreeableness, emotional stability, and so on. What conclusions can we draw about the meaning of Christmas? So my own thoughts are that meaning can be found in committing to a process of changing from a more vicious person to a more virtuous person, and more particularly, this is what Scrooge demonstrates in his change in socioeconomic philosophy and his transformation of personality. And so, his socioeconomic philosophy, his laissez-faire social economic philosophy, in some sense, I think, changes into a more ethical philosophy, and that ethical change maps onto or is connected with a transformation in his personality into a more ethical being, and a being that is less disagreeable and more agreeable, and less introverted, more extroverted, less neurotic and more emotionally stable. So it's in sort of the healthy restoration of these personality traits that perhaps Scrooge was deficient in, that he becomes a more ethical being, and then naturally this is connected with his philosophy becoming more ethical and insofar as he embodies that philosophy. So I think that's why his changes in philosophy and his changes in personality, his transformations of personality are meaningful. They're practically significant, and to the degree that they're practically significant, then I think that suggests that the meaning of Christmas is that Christmas time is a time in which, it's an opportune time to commit to that process of changing your philosophy and transforming your personality in a manner that's more ethical in the way that we've talked about. And, that's, again, this is getting back to, kairos, qualitative time, perhaps being, more significant than, say, like qualitative time or chronos. And so, Christmas time is an opportune time to make these meaningful personality changes and changes in your philosophy. And insofar as we're doing that, we're more closely approximating the spirit of Christmas, the spirit of benevolence as it manifests in our different personality traits, that are in proper proportion. So anyways, that's my kind of long-winded take on how this gets back to the meaning of Christmas. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Ryan, and then we can just close on that note.
Yeah, I think I agree with you pretty much entirely. I sort of wanted to just conclude with a quote that we did in the first part of our of this series.
Sure.
It's by my favorite philosopher, Nietzsche. And then I'll just sort of finish with a quick explanation. So it finishes with, I love New Year's Eve and birthdays. You can also include, Christmas in there. For they allow us hours, which admittedly we can often create for ourselves, but seldom do, in which the soul can still stand and review a phase of its own development. Crucial resolutions are born in such moments. For a few moments, one is raised above time and almost steps outside of one's own development. One secures and documents the past and receives the courage and resoluteness to resume traveling along one's path. This is by Friedrich Nietzsche. And I think it is really sort of, if you couple it with what you were saying, I think what Dickens is trying to convey is, if you talk in Nietzschean terms, is Scrooge can sort of be seen in this lion phase where he's very combative and, he sees everyone as the enemy, and I think what he's trying to urge Dickens is sort of this return or evolution towards being more of the child, which is being more in the moment, sort of transcending all of the concepts and ideas and the biases that we have, that we gain, when we become the camel and when we become the lion, all those things those biases that we have and that we're rebelling towards or against, we transcend them in some sense. So I think Dickens is asking us to sort of transcend these differences, right, return to a doctrine of Christian love, and in some sense, and I don't mean Christian in the organized sense. I mean in the Christ sense.
Right.
Because I don't think Nietzsche would be on board with the Christian sense. I mean Christ, right, as Christ is conveyed not in the Bible. Based on what Christ says, the words of Christ.
Right.
Right. But yeah. Anyhow, so I just think that what Dickens is trying to ask us is essentially what you were saying, take some time, pause, and think about how we relate to one another, how it is that we view one another, and just return to a doctrine of love, one where we spend time, quality time with one another, not just quantity.
Right. I think you summarize things up quite succinctly there, and I don't think I can really add much to that at this stage, other than it seems like Christmas time is meaningful insofar as it is a time that affords us to transcend ourselves and to aim towards that ethical ideal, that's perhaps represented by Christ and other individuals who represent that ethical ideal. So on that note, we're going to wrap things up for now. And we've got one remaining section we want to discuss in the next part of this episode, which will get at the ethical, the deeper ethical implications of the meaning of Christmas, and the factors that account for Scrooge's personality transformations. I'd like to hold up the lens a bit closer to that and get more deeply into the processes that affect that transformation, and what of course that implies about the meaning of Christmas. So it's going to be an interesting and lively conversation. So stay tuned for that. But for now, I'd like to sign off and hope that you tune in for the next one. So bye for now.